And our study session agenda, the first one is a 2022 legislative agenda highlights. And I'll turn this over to Garmin Newsom, our city attorney, and Lysette Cadena, our state lobbyist.
Hi. I don't actually have much to say other than Lysette Cadena is here to share her view, or at least her understanding of the 2022 legislative agenda highlights. Lysette.
Thank you, Garmin. Good evening, council members and mayor. It's good to see you all virtually. Hopefully sometime soon we can all see each other in person, maybe further on down the line as we get closer to the 23 legislative session. And I can't believe I'm just uttering those words. So next slide, please. So the 2022 session was a short 60-day session and moved at a rapid pace as legislators worked to pass bills, budget, and end on time. This was the 5th year in a row the legislature has ended on time. This session was a hybrid session, and what we mean by that is committee hearings, stakeholders, and constituent meetings with legislators were all virtual, while some floor debates and votes were conducted in a hybrid manner with some legislators there in person, and they definitely had to comply with COVID testing and COVID protocols and masking if they were going to be on the floor. The goals for this legislative session for the legislature were to make adjustments to all 3 budgets, operating, capital, and transportation, as well as address or work on addressing climate change, housing, homelessness, adjustments to police reform, and making changes to the long-term care program. Next slide, please. One of the largest tasks of the legislature was to write the 2022 supplemental operating budget. Given the extensive resources available due to a higher than projected quarterly economic and revenue forecast, the budget was much larger than typical for a supplemental year. And so what we mean by this is that the supplemental budget increases spending by $3.2 billion to address education funding needs, struggles in behavioral health, long-term care, developmental disability, and expand access to childcare. The supplemental budget spending increases over the 2-year operating budget to $64.1 billion. So, just a quick reminder, the legislature budgets in 2-year cycles. The 2-year budget was written last year during the 2021. And so this year they're making adjustments, and those adjustments added to about $3.2 billion in additional spending. So that is a sizable amount of money. Within that, it also includes a transfer of $2 billion to the new transportation revenue proposal called Move Ahead, as well as a $650 million transfer to the capital budget. So some of the highlights under this, what I would call substantial supplemental budget, is $10.2 million for the 988 call center, which comes into fruition this year, and they anticipate a very high call volume. So that is meant to deal with that. $5 million for overdose prevention and harm reduction, $55 million for homeless service provider stipends. So this is an increase to homeless service providers, especially for those workers or employees making 80% or less of the area median income. $45 million for the eviction rental assistance program. So this is on top of the money that was received last year. And this $45 million is a statewide that will have to be split amongst the statewide eviction program, and $100 million for utility assistance for low-income households that are in arrearages. And when we mean utilities, it could be electricity, gas, garbage, anything that falls under that utility that is not internet service would be available for them to receive assistance from this fund, as well as $7 million to increase the number of early childhood education and assistance program slots from 15,192 to 16,900. So it's a pretty substantial increase in childcare slots by fiscal year of 2025. Next slide, please. So with a huge amount of, huge being $650 million transferred from the operating budget to the capital budget. The capital budget spends about $1.5 billion in total funds. The investments focused in projects that create jobs, stimulate economic growth, emphasize racial equality in all parts of the capital budget. And some of the key investments that I know are very important to the council are there was $300 million for rapid capital housing acquisition program. And this funds the rapid conversion of properties into enhanced emergency shelter, permanent supportive housing, transitional housing, permanent housing, youth housing, or shelter for extremely low income individuals. 114 million was dedicated to the Housing Trust Fund, 14.9 million for homeless youth facilities, 2 million to preserve manufactured and mobile home communities. And then Mary's Place received an additional $3 million. $72 million was also allocated to expand care for individuals in crisis. And this money will expand and create new capacity for 24-hour crisis triage and crisis stabilization. 26.3 million for behavioral health community capacity grants. And under the local community projects, 2.4 million was secured by the Boulevard Park Sanitary Sewer Extension area, or neighborhood, I should say. Next slide. So transportation has usually been traditionally very quiet after the passage of the 2015 Connecting Washington Transportation Revenue Proposal. It is unprecedented that in a short session, 60 days, that the legislature would actually reach agreement on a new transportation funding proposal. And that is what they did. They reached agreement on a 16-year, $16.9 billion transportation funding package. It did not have much, I would say, it didn't have any support from Republicans. It was very much a Democratic-led, Democratic-created transportation revenue proposal. And it flipped the way transportation has been funded in this state by dedicating about $5 billion to what we would consider multimodal or green investments. And the reason they were able to do that is because they're taking money from the new carbon pricing system and dedicating it to those uses that cannot apply or receive 18th Amendment gas protected dollars. And then they also decided to fund a little bit, or depending on who you are, quite a bit in new projects, and then funding projects that have to be backfilled that have gone over in the Connecting Washington transportation space because of cost overruns, cost of materials have increased. So those projects have increased as well. I will say there's $1.2 billion dedicated for bikes and pedestrian improvements and projects, and that includes safe routes to schools. There's $3 billion dedicated for transit. This is an unprecedented amount that is dedicated to transit. And one of the interesting things is that there will be operating dollars given to transit agencies if they can agree to provide free transit service for those 18 years and younger. I know that the transit agencies are still working through that process to see what that is going to look like and how to shake that out. But that is one of the key principles of that $3 billion for transit. There's also $836 million for new hybrid ferries, $2.4 billion to address the fish culvert I should say. So that covers the full cost of that, as well as $3 billion for preservation and maintenance of the WashDOT system, and $2.7 billion for new projects. Most of those new projects are big critical projects such as the US 2 trestle and the I-5 River crossing. Next slide, please. So after all that budget discussion, you're probably wondering, okay, what are the key pieces of legislation that passed? So some of those key pieces are Senate Bill 5749. So this bill requires landlords to provide multiple or different rental payment options beyond just online, such as personal check, cashier's check or money order. This was very key and instrumental for a lot of folks who are not very familiar or do not trust using the internet as a way to pay for the rent. And so this is providing that option, which I think a lot of stakeholders and a lot of advocates really saw as a key move in allowing renters to pay in a manner that is feasible and easy for them. Another bill is House Bill 1643, and this one provides a real estate excise tax exemption for nonprofit housing developers and local governments when they are competing to purchase properties that will be utilized to build affordable housing. The real estate excise tax is a pretty sizable chunk of money, so this would definitely help reduce the cost of building and acquiring the land and then building the affordable housing units that are needed. Another interesting piece of legislation, and I would say is pretty big, is House Bill 1866. And this one will directly link healthcare and housing to those who need it. It treats chronic homelessness as a medical condition, invests in preventative services, creates more supportive housing, and expands the capacity of housing providers. And all of this falls under the scope of the new Apple Health and Homes Office under the Department of Commerce. There's about $60 million dedicated to this Apple Health and Homes program in the capital budget to provide rapid, permanent supportive housing, as well as about $47 million in the operating budget to get this program up and running, to create the office and make sure that there are enough people staffing this office to move these funds forward and to start serving this population. On the land use side, we definitely saw a lot of pieces of legislation trying to deal with land use, but I will say one of the key components that is critical for City of Burien is House Bill 1241. So this bill changes the update cycle for the comp plan update from 8 to 10 years. And in another interesting move, the legislature did provide about $10 million in the operating budget to help local jurisdictions in their planning efforts, which is really key because I know, the amount of money that it takes to update the comp plan and to move forward with a lot of key land use planning bills of this past couple years eats up a lot of money. And to have some money come from the state to help that I think is a key component to a lot of cities moving forward with implementing a lot of these land use changes. And then one thing I would like to know, I know this got a lot of play at the very beginning of session in January, but just to remind folks that the long-term care program the implementation of that program is delayed until July 1st, 2023. And along with that bill, the legislature did provide some exemptions to folks, mostly veterans, spouses, and domestic partners of military service members, and any employee that works in Washington State but maintains a primary residence, outside of Washington State. So this, with them kicking it down until 2023, they definitely anticipate potentially looking at the feasibility of this program in the 2023 session. So we are assuming that some components of that will come back next year. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the Eviction Prevention Assistance Program received $45 million, and then the Utility Assistance received $100 million to help low-income households. Both of those are very key and critical, especially as we still have a lot of constituents and state and individuals trying to grapple with how to move forward and pay a lot of the money that they didn't have up front to cover utility or rent payments. Next slide, please. So on top of working on all of those components, the legislature did have to deal with some tweaks to the large police reform bills that passed last session after some of them went to effect. And they were hearing from constituents and stakeholders that there were key components that weren't working for a lot of folks. And so two of those bills, one of them is House Bill 2037. This bill creates a clear definition and specifies when physical force is deemed necessary. And physical force means any act reasonable likely to cause physical pain or injury, or any other act exerted upon a person's body to compel, control, constrain, or restrain the person's movement. Physical force does not include pat downs, incidental touching, verbal commands, or compliant handcuffing where there is no physical force, with no physical pain or injury, excuse me. And another one that was very instrumental in moving this forward, as a lot of folks were hearing from communities not knowing how to respond to individuals in crisis. And so House Bill 1735 provides that an officer may use physical force to the extent necessary to transport a person for evaluation or treatment under civil and forensic commitment laws. So this was a big piece of legislation that needed to move forward, because a lot of folks were uncertain how to move forward with, helping those folks in crisis, getting them to the places that they needed, and the evaluation. Next slide, please. So under this, there are about $26.3 million provided under the capital budget for behavioral health community capacity grants. This is in the operating budget, which would fund behavioral health services, long-term commitments, triage, and crisis diversion. I will also say that the Criminal Justice Training Commission was also provided about $5.8 million to provide training to local law enforcement agencies on the passage of the reform bills last year, as well as the two bills that I just mentioned earlier. And they also were provided about $7.4 million for an additional 4.5 basic law enforcement academy classes in fiscal year 2022, and about 8.5 classes in fiscal year 2023. And the number of classes is very key in regards to getting officers the appropriate training and the appropriate education on how to be a police officer and how to respond to certain situations. The Criminal Justice Training Commission has really taken that goal on and really provides. In the past, there hasn't been enough funding to get all the new hires through the training. So this should be able to facilitate the movement of all those new hires through the training process. Next slide, please. Last year was also a pretty big year in regards to climate progress. The Climate Commitment Act, as well as the Low Carbon Fuel Standard, was passed. And so we will start seeing the implementation of those two bills towards the middle of this year. But in regards to what did the session do this year, I think three key components was passing House Bill 1799, which requires a separate organics collection service to be provided to residents and certain businesses in any cities with a population of 25,000 or more. And then House Bill 1663 is requiring methane capacity equipment to be installed in landfills. This bill was agreed to by a lot of the, I would say, service providers that run landfills, and agreed to it because they understand the benefits of making sure that they have methane reducing equipment at their areas. And another interesting note is Senate Bill 5722, and this one requires a Department of Commerce to adopt state energy management and benchmarking requirements for buildings between 20,000 and 50,000 square feet and multifamily residential buildings larger than 50,000 square feet by December 1, 2023. And to add on top of this, this may be getting a little too in the weeds for folks, but just something that I wanted to point out, that the Washington State Building Code Council this past Friday, passed a rule requiring that all new commercial buildings look at installing heat pumps for gas, for water heaters, and flexibility for that, as well as hookups to transition current gas appliances to electric gas appliances. So that'll be a new rule coming into place for a lot of commercial buildings. That rule is not in place for residential buildings as of yet, but please stay tuned because I'm sure that will filter down as the conversation moves forward at the State Building Code Council. Next slide, please. Oh, and with that, I just threw a lot of information at you, so happy to take any questions.
Okay. Council, any questions for Lizette? Oh, Councilmember Sarah.
Lizette, thank you. That was so comprehensive and really helped with a lot of the questions I would have had. But I have the question because I've heard quite a bit that the supplemental budget is larger than it normally would be. Does that mean that in the next biennium, a lot of those programs go away again? Are they something that we get for that 2-year cycle and then they fund out as the budget goes back to what we would normally expect?
No, that is a really good question. There are certainly some programs there that are one-time programs, but I would say a lot of the human services homelessness programs are long-term, and it just is going to depend on what the economic and revenue forecast comes in as, you know, what is the viability of their programs. I will say, because we have a really good real estate excise tax that is really the basis of this amount of money that the legislature has to play with, as long as the real estate market continues in the way it is, there will be money coming in to fund those programs. Now, there is a lot of concern that if we hit a recession, some of those new programs and new additional funding will be some of the first things on the chopping block, very similar to what the legislature had to do in 2008 when that recession happened. And we saw a lot of, you know, human services programs take the brunt force of how to balance that budget. So it is a concern. And a lot of folks are starting to think, okay, what mechanisms can we look at to potentially provide a dedicated revenue source? The issue is the way the legislature has limited funding sources to go about. So it's a tricky game and a tricky balance, but it's a very good question. And we'll see how the economic revenue forecasts play out in the next coming years.
Great. Councilmember Mata. Oh, you're on mute.
Lisa, thank you very much for your work down in Olympia. So I was hearing the report here, and I know that some of the challenges that we had because of COVID was rental protections. And so, you know, we've had a moratorium up that we've had connected to the governor's order. And I see that there's 5 bills that addresses, you know, the ability to make sure that you stay housed, right? So it looks like we have SB 5749 and then obviously H 43. Is there any more money in the state allocated for rental assistance? Because my understanding is that we've come to a place that there is no more money for rental assistance. We've come to a place where we have, you know, the people that have been, you know, suffering from this pandemic still not able to pay the rent. And then on top of that, we have landlords, you know, some of the smaller ones who are also getting behind on, you know, some of their mortgages. And so it's like, you know, this pandemic continues. And my understanding is that Washington State will stay signed up to the pandemic because it allows us to get federal funding for our state. But I wanted to kind of hear that because, you know, something that I get quite a bit of calls from, you know, developers and homeowner, property owners, and it's just something that I thought I'd ask you. Thank you.
No, that's a good question. So the 45 million in this supplemental is in addition to the money that was allocated last year. And I'm trying to pull up that exact figure. I will say there has been more need than there is money available. So that has always been a huge setback of this. Like the state using federal dollars and their dollars, just there's not enough money to address everybody. So that was one issue that they were dealing with, is they knew that they weren't going to be able to provide enough funding for everybody. And I know there was concern before the 22 session that some of the money wasn't being pushed out fast enough or soon enough through the county process. And I don't know if that has resolved or gotten better. But let me pull up the figure from last year. And I don't know if that helps answer your question, Councilmember Mata.
It does. It's, I think just with the amount of money that we put, 45 million plus whatever we did last year, it's a tough situation we're in. And so we see just inflation out of control. I can tell you that I'm in the commercial industry, and, although we've heard that there's going to be transportation dollars coming into the industry, I see the market cooling down. Now that could be because Teamsters were on strike for, 5 months. But it's, scary times entering into the middle of a war. And then on top of that, having an economy that sourcing things. And so I've heard we have another, the pandemic or new variant. And so to me, it's like, we need to be realistic of what this looks like for our, businesses in our city, and then also our residents in our city, and those who own property, and those who rent property. So I just wanted to make sure that, we as a council and as a state and the county government, that we have these realistic conversations. And I think there's been some cities that decided to keep on the moratorium like ours, and there's been some that decided that they got to get this thing situated. So thank you.
Yes. And so last year's biennial budget allocated about 89 million for the eviction rental assistance program, and then also set aside 11.6 million for landlord mitigation. And that was to help landlords mitigate some of the rental arrearages that they were dealing with. And then there was about, I would say, close to 133 million for housing and homelessness assistance. And that mostly of that was to provide hotel and motel vouchers, as well as rapid rehousing and associated services.
Councilmember Garcia.
Thank you, Lisette, for the presentation. A lot of great information. I'm just following up on Councilmember Mata's questions. Really good points there. My question, I guess, is a little bit more general and may need to be answered offline a bit. But you mentioned a lot of money being thrown at it, not thrown at it, but invested into the state, from the state, for the entire state. I'm interested to find out, of all this allocated money, how much of it actually got to our city? And how long does it take for the supplement the budget that just got done to get into our city coffers, I guess, for programs and services?
So most of the funding will be allocated through the eviction assistance programs is through formula based, and it goes to counties. So the Department of Commerce does that, gives the money to the counties, and the county then runs the program to provide the eviction assistance programs. Yes, exactly. So the new money that was just appropriated doesn't start moving until July 1st of this year, because that's when the new fiscal year starts.
Oh, okay.
So the fiscal year for the state is a little bit, it's not a calendar year. Their fiscal year is July 1 through June 30th. So that's the first fiscal year, and then the next fiscal year begins. So what they were doing is just making and last year they passed their 2-year budget, and then every short session they come in and make adjustments based on, economic revenue forecast, where new programs that maybe folks may want to create. So there is a little bit of a lag of when the legislature ends and this new money kicks in.
So if I heard you right, in essence, the new budgeted money from this session is going to start trickling into the county around July. through September, August, and eventually probably refill up some of the EPRA funding and catch up to the thousands and hundreds that didn't get help.
It should, but I will give a caveat that just because the new budget goes into effect July 1st doesn't mean that those dollars will be pushed out by the Department of Commerce by then.
Got it.
The Department of Commerce it'll take staff and everybody a little bit more time to really push those dollars out.
Yeah, so likely
And then-
third, fourth quarter.
Sorry.
Okay, thank you.
And then, then the county should receive a portion of that. I will say it still probably won't be enough to meet the need that is very high here in King County, because I know that the need has definitely outstripped the amount of money that is available.
Councilmember Sarah.
Yeah, I wanted to just follow up and say, keep going with climate action and with climate forward legislation. But I am really happy to see that we're doing some things on methane and on some of the situations where, methane in a landfill doesn't benefit anybody. And I'm really glad to see that we're getting some of those areas where it just is win-win for all of us to capture those greenhouse gases and prevent them from getting out.
Agreed. And I will say, whatever you're hearing that California is doing in regards to anything in climate policy, housing policy, homelessness policy, has a way of making its way up to Oregon and Washington. And I'm sure that we will see some of, if they move forward with anything, we will potentially see legislation on that in the 2023 legislative session.
Lysette, I have a follow-up question on the housing. Since you mentioned the 2021 funds and there was a adjustment to the supplemental, then that means that the earlier funding has been expended.
Well, that means that the state has allocated that money. I don't know if King County has used up all of that money that came from the state.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And with the supplemental funds, is this one time?
Yes.
Okay. Great. Councilmember Mora or Schilling, any questions from you?
No, thank you.
Okay.
Nope, none for me.
Okay. I do have a follow-up question about the transportation budget, and there were funds taken from the
Public Works
Public
Trust
Works.
account.
So, and this might be a question for staff as well as you, Lizette, is what impact to Burien does that create when there's money removed from the Public Works Trust Fund?
So I will say that there hasn't been any money in the Public Works Trust account because the legislature swept that funding to deal with McCleary in 2017. And so in order for them in 2017, when they made that sweep of the Public Works Trust account, they said that potentially the money would come back in 2023. So now the money that was supposed to come back, they are keeping a portion of that with another portion starting to trickle back into the Public Works Trust account. So there hasn't been money for Burien or other cities to apply for projects in the Public Works Trust accounts since that money was swept in 2017 to fund McCleary. There has been money dedicated to the Public Works Trust account, but it has been for very specific causes like broadband, but not the typical infrastructure projects that it was created for. So now there is $1.7 billion is transferred from the Public Works Trust account to fund the Move Ahead transportation revenue package, but is not done in one sweep. It's about $114 million per year that is moved from that account to fund the new transportation revenue proposal. So there will still be money going in. I think folks are a little unsure in regards to like how much or what the ability will be of the Public Works Board to start moving forward with its intended purpose. So that will be, I think, stay tuned for that, especially this coming session.
Okay, great. Anyone else have questions for Lizette? And for those, just for the audience, can and Lizette, you might be able to give specific examples. So the Public Works Trust Fund's original intent is to fund what type of projects? What are some big examples?
So a lot of it was infrastructure projects that was connecting. Before I speak out of turn, let me actually pull my notes up because I don't want to give incorrect information. Sorry, my apologies. It's taking a little bit longer.
Okay.
So it was like a water treatment station is one example. Damaged caused by to a road by a landslide. Let me pull up some other ones. Okay, 1 second. So it's domestic water projects, road, street projects, bridges, sanitary sewer projects, solid waste and recycling projects, and stormwater projects.
Okay. Thank
Those are
you.
the infrastructure systems that would be potentially seek funding under the Public Works Trust Board.
Great. Anyone have questions for Lizette? And one more question, Lizette, how are funds generated for the Public Works Trust Fund?
It is through the real estate excise tax as a portion of their funding, and something else that I'm forgetting off the top of my head that I will get back to you and make sure that I copy council on all of it.
Okay. Thank you so much. So one last ask, does anyone have follow-up questions for Lizette? Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much for that really comprehensive overview and for being open for follow-up questions. And I'm sure we'll think of some down the road. Thank you. Thank you for representing us.